Settings, costumes, lighting, and figure movement, even acting and sound, all function as elements of mise-en-scène. But what really makes mise-en-scène work is how its visual elements are arranged or composed within each shot. So let's take a quick look at some composition guidelines and conventions. We'll start with the box within which all this visual information gets arranged. The frame used to be one consistent size and shape. Now it varies. And of course, the size and shape of your frame will have an impact on the arrangement of its visual elements. Composing for a square screen is different than composing for a wide screen rectangle. Which brings us to the whole idea of balance. As a rule, our minds, and by extension our eyes, seek equilibrium and order. On the movie screen, and in its less lively ancestors, the painting and the still photograph, that order takes the form of a balanced composition. The so-called rule of thirds breaks the frame into 3 vertical sections and 3 horizontal sections, resulting in a grid. This grid acts like a guide which artists use to balance visual elements in the frame. It's not an exact science. Art is never that simple. The basic idea is that composition is built in units of 3: top, middle, bottom, left, center, right, foreground, middle ground, and background. And often, for every visual element placed on one section, there will be some sort of corresponding element in the opposite section to counterbalance the composition. In this very balanced composition from Lawrence of Arabia, the visual weight of the well at the bottom of the frame is offset by the approaching figure, whose weight comes not from size and frame, but from its centered position, and its stark contrast against the band of sky dominating the top horizontal band, which is in itself in contrast with the muted browns of the rest of the frame. Adding to the top figure's significance are the implied eye lines and obvious attentions of the 2 characters balancing the wide-screen composition. And they'd better pay attention, because he's on his way to kill them for drinking his well water. The grid's top horizontal line allows for another very practical application. Cinematographers figured out a long time ago that by framing a character's eyes along this upper line, they could quickly and efficiently establish a practical and aesthetically pleasing placement of the face with just the right amount above of what is called headroom. Sometimes a story calls for composition that pushes the idea of balance to the next level, resulting in compositions that are so perfectly balanced that one side of the frame virtually mirrors the other. This symmetry can, depending on the context in which it's used, convey a sense of rigid order, strict control, or formal elegance, among other things. Sort of a super-balanced frame, the ultimate application of the rule of thirds. Of course, rules are made to be broken, especially when it comes to the movies. By purposely breaking the rule of thirds and denying our expectation of balance, filmmakers can create what Bruce Maimer calls compositional stress. This imbalance can communicate all kinds of things, as always depending on the context in which it's used. A character is made to appear diminished or weak, or simply different. A moment is infused with tension. A premonition of something wrong is planted. But sometimes what might appear to be imbalance is indirectly maintaining a different sort of balance. It all depends on what the subject is doing. Here, I'll explain. When a character is looking across the screen, he's typically placed on one end of the frame so that his gaze is balanced with what is called eye room, or looking room, on the opposite side. The practicality of this method is proven by its standardization. How often do you see a shot framed like this? Same goes for walking. A character whose movement is covered with a tracking shot is invariably given lead room on the side of the frame toward which he or she is moving. Another application of apparent imbalance is something called negative space. We're so used to the rule of thirds that sometimes when we're presented with a lopsided composition, an expectation is created that something will arrive to restore balance. Here, negative space foreshadows the inevitable arrival of a man-eating alien. Same here, except now it's a hobbit-eating spider. Okay then, so far we've been dealing mainly with only 2 dimensions, height and width. Which makes sense since motion pictures may move, but they're still just 2-dimensional images. But the world they depict features a 3rd dimension, depth, and the movies use the appearance of depth in all kinds of aesthetic and narrative ways. Deep space composition emphasizes depth by placing significant visual and narrative information on 2 or more of the 3 planes of depth, foreground, middle ground, and background in such a way that not only emphasizes depth, but also conveys information, mood, and meaning. This meaning can take many forms depending on how the levels of depth are presented. Relative size and frame position often tell us a lot. For example, this shot in Citizen Kane features characters empowered to decide young Charlie's fate large in the foreground, with Charlie's ineffectual father fluttering helplessly about in the middle ground, and the small, innocent, and powerless subject of their argument framed neatly in the background between them. Later in the film, the dissolution of a friendship is portrayed with the now powerful and power-hungry Kane looming in the foreground, his rejected confidant, Leland, much smaller in the middle ground, and poor, tiny Mr. Bernstein watching helplessly from the far background. The literal distance between them emphasizes their emotional distance. When Kane's wife Susan attempts suicide, deep space composition makes clear that pain-killing drugs influence Susan more than her distant husband. And Citizen Kane doesn't hold the monopoly on large foreground elements threatening smaller middle ground subjects. Poisoned coffee dwarfs its intended victim in this shot from Hitchcock's Notorious. And in Kubrick's The Shining, first the evidence of Jack's insanity dominates Wendy, then Jack himself steps into the foreground to do the same thing. Deep space composition is often referred to as deep focus composition, but that term can be misleading since it implies that all three planes of depth must be in focus. They often are, as with this shot from The Little Foxes. But this very scene demonstrates that visual elements need not be focused to still qualify as significant narrative information. In this scene, the invalid Horace has just denied his wife Regina the money she wants for a morally dubious investment. And so, in return, she's calmly detailing her long-standing contempt for him. First, this hurts his feelings, and then it sparks the beginnings of a heart attack, which just goes to prove that large foreground imagery doesn't always denote power. Sometimes its prominence simply conveys narrative significance. A bit later in the scene, he tries to jumpstart his failing heart, but drops the vital medication. When he asks his wife to hurry upstairs for the spare bottle, she weighs her options and decides that a fatal heart attack would free up the funds for her investment. Seeing that she's not going to budge, Horace has no choice but to try and get it himself. Okay, here's where deep space composition, but not deep focus, tells us a story. As Horace struggles from middle ground to background, he moves farther and farther out of focus. But that doesn't mean he's not significant. Instead, his increasing fuzziness communicates his rapidly fading grip on life, and his wife's effort to shut her husband's death out of her consciousness and her conscience.